This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jason Warner, K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist, kicks off today's show as he discusses research looking into forage quality on land in the Conservation Reserve Program. Continuing today's show is Jackie McClaskey, CEO and President of the American Royal Association, as she shares her perspective on biosecurity and what people can do. She talked on this topic at the Flinchbaugh Forum. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd ends the show covering a variety of current insect pests, including mimosa webworm, fall armyworm, and crickets. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing assessing forage quality with K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Shelby. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you, as always.
Jason, you've recently done some work that is looking into forage quality, and can you tell us about what this project and work was?
You bet. So I wanted to take this time to talk a little bit about a extension-focused research assessment project that we recently wrapped up here at the end of last year, really focused on helping us understand the nutrient composition and the changes that we see in nutrient composition with regards to forage quality of our lands that are enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP program, around the state of Kansas. We felt that this was really important as we took a look at some of the areas with regards to forage and rangeland, nutrient quality, nutrient assessment. This was an area that we really, as you take a look at it across the state, we don't have a lot of really good information readily available with which that we can use to guide producers when it comes to making management decisions. And we know that as we take a look at it, really as a proportion of the total amount of rangeland acres that we have here in the state of Kansas, our CRP acres comprise about 12% of that. And we know that our CRP tracts and lands vary quite a bit across the state. But we do know that there's a lot of land out there that gets enrolled in this program that is utilized at various times throughout the year by our producers, and certainly that is heavily dependent on drought and other forage use declarations by which our FSA organizations, our FSA offices that regulate how those lands are managed. We know that the use of those forage lands is going to be heavily dependent on drought and forage disaster declarations that we see from year to year. So at the end of the day, we know that we have a lot of land that's enrolled in this program around the state, and at times it's a really important forage resource for our producers. And so when we think about producers that are going to be utilizing these acres, regardless if it's for grazing or for haying, being able to turn cattle out and make management decisions and understand what our composition is from a nutrient standpoint, so we can make informed management and supplementation and feeding decisions around that. That's really, really important. So what it entailed was over the last 2 years, we had a group of extension agents and beef cattle specialists from around the state that worked with local producers to identify tracts or lands that they managed that we could sample for forage quality assessment. And so we worked with those producers to sample those tracts on a monthly basis throughout the year to help understand the changes that we see in nutrient composition when we think about protein and energy throughout the year, because we know that certainly that changes as those forages are in the growing stage. And then, of course, when we get closer on into the fall and the winter, as those forages become dormant and growth ends there as we get closer to the winter season. But really, as you take a look at it as well, too, as I mentioned, we have a lot of variability in terms of composition of the forages that make up those tracts, but then also, too, things like moisture and soil composition and the length of the growing season will certainly influence composition as well, too. And so we wanted to try to collect samples from broad of an area across the state, representing all the areas of the state that we practically could to try to help understand and account for those differences that we see. So we sampled forages across 16 different counties, representing about 20 different producers across the state of Kansas. And really, it's quite interesting when you take a look at it. When you think about just crude protein content, we see some really, I would say, pretty typical changes there throughout the year where, on average, when we look at our tracks, we see fairly low crude protein levels down less than 4%, between 3 and 4% crude protein on dry matter basis in the wintertime. But when we get out into the middle of the growing season, we see on average those samples get as high as 6, 7, 8% crude protein. And depending on management, we can see some samples that would be as high as 12 to 16% crude protein on a dry matter basis. But generally speaking, when we look at our main nutrient components that we're concerned with when we think about making supplementation decisions and managing cows on these forage resources, we think about crude protein and energy, we see some pretty typical changes there throughout the year that we would generally expect to see when we think about our native rangelands. At the end of the day, there's lots of variation, and that's certainly something that we see. But an important thing to keep in mind with these data is that they are there to help serve as a guide and as a starting point for producers when they're in situations when they have to manage cattle on these forage bases. It's really interesting also, too, we took a look at macro minerals. So we took a look at calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And we see some really interesting changes in those mineral concentrations throughout the year. When we think about calcium, which is a really important mineral for us, we think about the need for making sure that we've got plenty of calcium in the diet and understanding where the calcium level is in these forages. When we think about developing mineral supplementation programs to match that forage base, on average throughout the year, we see calcium levels anywhere from about 0.3% on up to as high as about 0.7% on a dry matter basis. But we can see samples as low as maybe 0.1% or less than 0.1%, all the way out to nearly 2% on a dry matter basis. And again, lots of variability there, both across the year when we think about from January all the way throughout December, but then also too as we think about what region of the state that those samples were collected from. And so we broke down when we did our analysis and looked at the data, we simply broke out the samples as whether they were collected from western Kansas or from eastern Kansas to help just account for some of that variability that we generally see and to help us categorize what we generally see as we change across soil types and as we move from east to west across the state. Phosphorus, a really important mineral for us when we think about developing our mineral supplementation programs, and one mineral that's really, really important, especially from a cost standpoint, pretty low phosphorus concentrations, on average anywhere from about 0.05 out to 0.17% on a dry matter basis. And then when we think about some of the other important macro minerals, specifically potassium and magnesium, we see quite a bit of variability there. Potassium was one that we saw really changed a lot throughout the year, especially as we went into the middle of the growing season. During the dormant season months, during the winter months, potassium concentrations across all these forage samples were quite low, but really increased quite rapidly as we got into the middle of the growing season, looking at April, May, June timeframe. And that really matches a lot of traditional data or a lot of other data that we would see in terms of increasing potassium content as we advance throughout the growing season. So I think a really interesting data set that, again, at the end of the day, it's there to help serve as a resource and as a guide for producers when they're in situations when they're going to utilize these forage resources. And it applies for both grazing as well as haying situations as well, too, because we sampled all of the forage within a given area and collected all of the growth that was available there to help understand the total nutrient composition that was available.
Jason, a few times you've noted the variability across the state, but was there anything that was consistent?
I think the biggest thing that was certainly very consistent was that as we evaluated both crude protein and energy composition in those samples, we saw some very consistent trends in terms of crude protein increasing throughout the middle part of the growing season, especially as we look at the months of April, May, and June, and then decreasing as we advance closer towards the fall and towards the winter months, and energy availability matching those crude protein values as well too. So in general, those forages increased in quality as we would expect or should expect as those plants are vegetative and actively growing, and then composition or nutrient content decreasing as we get into the winter months. So again, really important from just helping us have some good usable data to be able to work with. And then as we think about it, if we need to do, as we think about a producer that's going to be utilizing this information, if they're in a situation where they're going to be grazing for several months at a time on these forage resources, we can always do site-specific management and site-specific sampling to help assess what we have there more locally. But this helps from the standpoint of having some good workable information to guide producers with, so producers aren't flying blind, essentially.
If people have questions about this work, how could they get them answered?
Feel free to reach out to your local extension office in your local county or district unit. Reach out to your state or regional beef cattle specialist, and information on this project will be reported in complete form at the Cattlemen's Day program, which will be next spring here at Manhattan. So we encourage folks to stay tuned for Cattlemen's Day and watch for that information to be released. We have an annual report of experiment station research, and we have an annual report of beef cattle-oriented research projects that are available at that event. And so just encourage folks to stay tuned, and that information will be presented then.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Shelby. Appreciate it.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking with a person from the Flinchbaugh Forum, Jackie McClaskey, who is the president and CEO of the American Royals Association. Jackie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby, for asking.
Jackie, you talked on a topic of what keeps ag leaders up at night, and you focused in on biosecurity. And so when someone just says biosecurity to you, what do you think of?
Food and agricultural biosecurity is basically the protection of the agricultural industry. It's the idea of protecting the industry from any type of threat, whether that's intentional, accidental, natural, whatever that might be. So there are lots of issues that come to mind when we think about biosecurity. We tend to think about things that might impact the animal ag industry, but it certainly crosses the entire industry into crops and food as well.
Do you feel like this is something that people always keep on their mind, or really just comes up when something's happened?
I think for most people, this is an issue that comes to mind when something happens, when it's in the headlines or where there's a threat. Individual producers might have, some really good biosecurity procedures at their own operations, going into a dairy or a swine operation or whatever that might be. But when it really comes to thinking about big picture biosecurity policy, we tend to kind of put it in the closet unless there's something going on that makes us aware and ready to act.
So do you feel like this is something that not only the producer who's maybe on a swine operation in Kansas is not only their job, but at the federal government to help figure out what can we do?
When you think about biosecurity policy, it really is at all levels. It does start with the producer, as you mentioned, but then it comes down to what's the role of the state government, the federal government, and even the local government. When it comes time to stop movement, for example, in the case of an animal disease outbreak, you need the local county government on board. That it's going to be them that's actually putting up the blockades or whatever that might be. But when it really comes to those big picture policy issues, the state and the federal government need to find a way to work together and come up with some solutions on some of these topics.
What do you think is important for coming up with those solutions?
When you think about biosecurity policy, really what it comes down to is modeling the Barry Flinchbaugh alternatives and consequences model. There are a lot of policy questions. There are a lot of alternative answers to those questions, and you have to walk through the consequences of those. As I used earlier, the example of closing a border, whether that's about closing the border right now between the U.S. and Mexico because of New World screwworm, or whether that's closing a border at the time of a foot and mouth disease outbreak, or if that's a county County taking those acts, there's a lot of consequences to those decisions. Some are short-term, some are long-term. They have different impacts on different people. So just using that as an example, we need to know ahead of time what's going to be the trigger that makes us close a border. And in doing so, and when we are going to stop movement, what are the repercussions? And we have to make sure we know the answer of when we're going to allow movement to get back at work, right? And those are all things that if you don't have those answers figured out ahead of a crisis, then during a crisis is not the right time to be making those decisions.
For figuring out those answers, who do you think should be involved in that conversation? Is it one profession or multiple?
I believe it is a multiple professions because so many people are impacted. Obviously, producers need to be at the forefront, but they need to be supported by people who understand the science and the economics, our animal health professionals at the state level, our state government leaders, USDA, of course. All of those folks need to be at the table. And as you've mentioned, we're at the Flinchbaugh Forum, and that's part of what the Flinchbaugh Center can help do is really help those policymakers understand the alternatives and consequences of those different choices and be able to make decisions that are going to be the best for the industry and the people the industry serves.
We've focused a lot on our producers and the government, but what about our consumers and customers?
Consumers spend very little time talking about biosecurity. However, when something happens, they start to pay attention. Sometimes, there are cases like avian influenza where they've heard about it enough, but they might maybe gotten to the place where they hear about it again. It's really not impacting whether or not they're eating chicken on that day. But what we don't know is if other things would happen that we are not necessarily prepared for, how is that going to affect consumer demand? What are consumers going to expect in our response? If consumers see things happening and see video of us dealing with live animals in a way that they don't think is appropriate because we're trying to depopulate or we're trying to deal with carcasses in the case of a very dramatic situation, how are they going to respond and how long is it going to last? And we saw that it had lasting impacts in some cases in the UK when they dealt with foot and mouth disease outbreak. So the consumer component is maybe today feels simple and maybe it's not something that's a big issue to them, but whatever those policy decisions are, it's one of the consequences we need to analyze is what is the consumer impact?
What policy decisions would you really like to see put in or thought through? So, as you mentioned, that decisions can be made before the war.
Well, first and foremost, I think in regard to animal disease, we need to really get a stronger handle on traceability and really ask the questions of what components should be voluntary and what those pieces should look like. And is there any additional mandatory components that need to exist? And I know as someone growing up in the ag world, I'm always in favor of voluntary, but also making sure that we're doing what we need to do to protect the industry and moving forward. And I think once you get past traceability, then it's really about thinking about disease response. We didn't talk about today, but vaccination policy is a big issue. A lot of people want to treat, like back to the example of foot and mouth disease again, they want to treat vaccination as a silver bullet. It is not. We cannot get vaccines out across the country and disseminated and honestly even produced at the quantity we need to solve the problem. It's one component of a policy response, but it can't be seen as the only policy response. So we can't look now and say, okay, we have a vaccination policy in place, shake each other's hands and say, good job, we're ready, because we're not. So I think it's really about dissecting these issues into all the different components and starting with something big like traceability, looking at vaccine policy, looking at stop movement orders. All of those things matter when it comes to dealing with an animal disease outbreak.
Do you see a value of needing cohesion between states when we think about biosecurity?
Yes. There's definitely a need for states to work together. The foreign animal disease exercise that's held every year by the Kansas Department of Agriculture typically includes multiple states, and there are multiple other organizations and efforts to bring states together. But at the same time, if the responsibility lies with the states, then those states need to take that responsibility on and cooperate and collaborate and learn from their neighbors. But in the end, you also have to protect your state's industry. So yes, I believe in the concept of collaboration and having consistency among states. I think that's absolutely critical, especially when we see how much cattle move. But at the same time, individual states need to step up and do what they need to do if the other states don't want to go along with them.
And just thinking scenarios here, if we ever have a mandatory traceability, what would be an issue you could see in for our future for thinking specifically about our producers today?
Well, I think first and foremost, one of the reasons that producers are not supportive of a mandatory policy in general is because nobody really feels confident with what's happening with that data. Producers run private businesses, right? We talk about farms and ranches being both, a livelihood and a family, but in the end, it's their business operation. And to take data from their business and know that anybody else has access to it, which is what happens in a mandatory system, it really starts to probably erode people's confidence and it makes them uncomfortable with who has control of that data. So I think that's a big part of that voluntary versus mandatory issue. Again, it's also an issue of if it's mandatory, who's paying for it? Who is making it reasonable for a cow-calf producer to go out there and buy the right tags and track them and turn that information in? So there's a lot of questions there when it comes to cost and data management and all those types of things.
So if we're thinking about our farmers and ranchers and who are listening today, what final thoughts would you like to leave with them when it comes to biosecurity?
The key message that people need to understand is this has to be something we think about. I use the term in the forum, good or bad, in non-wartime. We need to spend time really talking through what are the right policy approaches and the policy decisions. So when we are faced with a crisis or a disease outbreak or whatever it might be, that we know exactly what we're going to do. And I think that New World screwworm is a perfect example of that. I mean, we shut our borders, but we've got different segments of the industry saying it's time to reopen, others saying, no, keep them shut. And as we await whether or not we're going to find it in the U.S., then that's going to start to become a state issue as well of whether or not individual states are going to step up. And if you don't know those answers today, it makes it very difficult. So it's really about putting biosecurity policy at the top of the list, along with the other really key policy issues, and making sure we know what the right approaches are. So when the time comes, we're ready.
Jackie, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was President and CEO of the American Royal Association, Jackie McClaskey, and she was one of the panelists at the recent Flinchbaugh Forum. If you'd like to learn more about the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy, you can do so by going to flinchbaughcenter.com. I will link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before I cut to a break, I would like to let you know about a couple of other things that will also be linked in today's show notes. The first one will be a flyer to the Crop Insurance Workshop, which is taking place October 16th in Salina, Kansas. The deadline for registration is October 13th. I would also like to remind you about the 77th Annual Kansas Income Tax Institute, which is taking place at a variety of different locations. There are some online options as well as some in-person options around the state. You can find more information about both of these events also by going to AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. If you've noticed some damage to your honey locust trees, it's probably being caused by the second generation of mimosa webworms. However, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd says you'll have to wait until spring to apply a treatment. He also covers fall webworm, fall armyworm, mosquitoes, and crickets. Raymond, let's start off by talking about mimosa webworm. We are seeing some damage there.
Oh, substantial damage, Jeff. If you're out there looking at your honey locust and the leaves are brown, it looks like it's been hit by a blowtorch. That's damage associated with the mimosa webworm. It is caterpillar. It creates this webbing. It feeds, and then the leaves die. There's nothing you can do right now. But be aware next year, be out early spring looking for the caterpillars and before they create the webs, because once they create those webs, insecticides will no longer be effective. So at this point, if your trees are damaged, there's nothing you can do. If they're mature, they'll generally be able to survive 1 or 2 years of that kind of damage. If it's more, then they can be susceptible to wood-boring insects. But just be cognizant, the organism responsible is the mimosa webworm.
Okay, so then what about the fall webworm? What's the difference there?
That's a good question, Jeff. The fall webworm, very similar to mimosa webworm. They create these webs in the trees, and if you drive the back roads of Kansas, you see them on walnuts and pecans and hickory and those type of trees. But that's the second generation, and eventually the trees are going to lose leaves, deciduous ones, and allocate resources down to the growth into storage roots. The first generation in spring, if you see webbing in the tree, you can either prune it out. You can't spray because they stay within the nest, so you have to either disrupt the nest with high-pressure water sprays or a rake. But generally, it's localized infestations and it's mature trees they will feed upon. But if you've got young trees, you probably should either prune it out or disrupt it and maybe make an application of some type of insecticide such as BTK, Bacillus thuringiensis Kawasaki, or the spinosad on the young larva. But at this point, there's no need to implement any type of plant protection strategies.
The fall armyworm is still active.
We have seen fall armyworm damage on turf grass last couple weeks. They're in the later instars. Remember that they will not overwinter here. They only overwinter in Florida and Texas. And then they'll get caught up as moths in the jet stream. So I'm not sure if we'll get a third generation. I think we're looking at the second right now. But if the weather stays warm, conducive, we could get a third. Just be on the lookout. Watch your turf grass. Look for moths. Look for egg nasses laid on your decks or whatever, gray egg nasses. We do have an extension publication you can download that provides more information on the fall armyworm.
And just because we're into fall doesn't mean that we might not see some mosquitoes still.
If the weather's still conducive and there's standing water, the mosquitoes can still breed. So the main, what we call the main strategies, the three main strategies of dealing with the mosquitoes is remove any standing water because that's where they breed. Puddles or whatever if you can. Obviously, some of that won't be practical. Wear repellents when you're outside. DEET is still the main one, but IR 3535 and pericardium are two others. And then lemongrass of eucalyptus does provide some protection, not the same level as DEET. And then, of course, if you have ponds or areas which you have fish or sensitive areas, you can use the mosquito dunks. And those have BTI, that's the Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis. That's a relative of Kawasaki, which we use for caterpillars, but it only kills mosquito larvae. They have to eat it, and then they die, and then you don't get adults. So just heed by those strategies and read the extension publication and be aware that mosquitoes could still be active this time of year, especially if we get some more warm spells and we continue to get moisture.
Crickets have also been a problem the last couple of years.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I've gotten a call about crickets in brome and grass, but last year, one of the producers I work with in Cortland had substantial damage, economic damage on his pumpkins from crickets. This is the house cricket, a black cricket, and they were feeding upon it. One of the issues is when you've got this cover of dead debris or whatever, they reside in there, so it's really hard to get them on contact. But yes, this is the second year in a row that we've had inquiries regarding house crickets feeding on plants, in this case fruit, on the pumpkins and plants outdoors, on brome or I think it was alfalfa too, they're feeding upon.
And again, all sorts of publications available through Extension.
Absolutely. We keep building a plethora of Extension publications. We just have 2 new ones this year, cicada killer and lace bugs. And you can always contact our Department of Entomology at Kansas State if you have inquiry, and they will guide you to the individual that can best serve you.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with an update on insect pest activity in Kansas. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.